right, welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Anderson, and I'm the Rural Program Director for Springboard for the Arts. I have brown hair, glasses, light skin, and I'm wearing a black cardigan over a striped and black and white shirt. And I use she, her pronouns. I live in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, which is a town of 13,000 people on Dakota and Anishinaabe land in west central Minnesota, which is about 3 hours north of the Twin Cities. Thank you all so much for joining us for this inaugural episode of From the Field. Today, we're really looking forward to imagining the future of artists as economic developers with M. Johnson and Jack Forinash from Blue Sky Center in New Cuyama, California, and with Drew Digby from the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council in Duluth, Minnesota. And I just want to share a little bit that this new monthly series has been developed over the last few months in response to several needs that we've heard from rural artists across the country, and specifically over the last 8 months, as we have all navigated the effects of this pandemic, and also our individual and collective roles and responsibility in this current racial and social justice movement across the United States. Our goal with From the Field is to bring together artists across the country from rural areas who are reimagining the future of rural America. And by recording these conversations, we also hope to create an archive for this critical time in rural art, community, and culture, as well as provide content that you can either choose to attend in real time like you are today, or absorb away from your screen, perhaps on a walk or in the car at a later date. And these monthly artist-to-artist talks will explore rural-specific topics, such as how we're responding to the COVID situation, conversations about equity and justice, food systems, agriculture, and more, and all through the lens of rural artists, culture bearers, and makers. I'll mention that next month's conversation is titled Imagining the Future of Being a Good Relative, and that will feature the Native Artist Collective based in Rapid City, South Dakota, called Racing Magpie, and it'll be hosted by Ashley Hansen from the Department of Public Transformation. So we invite you to suggest future topics or speakers in the feedback form that we'll share after this event. And we'll also be keeping our eyes out for other meaningful ways to help us all stay connected during this time. And since this series is a program of Springboard for the Arts, I just wanted to briefly share a little bit about who we are in case you're not familiar. So Springboard is a community and economic development organization for artists based both in St. Paul and in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And we do programming right in our local neighborhoods and communities, but also statewide across Minnesota and also across the country. And specifically, our rural programs consist of convenings like the Rural Arts and Culture Summit, support for artists in many different ways, including our Hinge Arts residency and professional development programs, and also technical assistance for community development initiatives like our Artists on Main Street program. So if you'd like to learn more about Springboard, make sure to visit our website and check out our event calendar. We always have something going on for people from all backgrounds. And so we encourage you to find all those opportunities. We also have toolkits and artist profiles on our Creative Exchange platform. And finally, before we get started, I want to extend gratitude and thanks to the Blandin Foundation and to the Minnesota Disaster Recovery Fund for their support on this program and helping us keep rural folks connected through creativity and imagining the future during this time. And with that, I will hand it over to Hannah Holman, who is our amazing project manager for this rural network.
Thanks, Michelle. And as Michelle mentioned, my name is Hannah Holman. I'm the project manager for the Rural Arts and Culture Summit and the Rural Arts and Culture Recovery Network with Springboard for the Arts. I have light blue hair in a braid, light skin, and I'm wearing a black turtleneck. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I want to ground us in our time in our virtual space today with some housekeeping and acknowledgements. So this session will be in a webinar format, and that means that attendees will not have access to microphone or video capabilities, but we ask that you please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of the Zoom window to submit any questions that come up throughout our time, as there will be some time at the end of the conversation to answer those. As Michelle mentioned, this session will be recorded for access at a later time and for folks for whom reliable internet access for live programming is a barrier. Automated closed captioning is available for today's conversation, and you can turn on subtitles by clicking the closed captioning or CC button in the bottom of your Zoom window. I want to acknowledge that we're all humans together in this internet world, and in the event that our webinar freezes or lags, or you're having some internet troubles like me, challenge yourself to take a moment to breathe and contemplate one of the last things you heard, instead of feeling agitated by those inevitable tech hiccups. And wherever you are, I'd ask that you now find a place where you can be in a comfortable position with your feet touching the floor, if possible, and we can ground ourselves together for a moment. So I'd like to take this moment to recognize that Springboard for the Arts is based in Minnesota on land that was and is the home of the Dakota and the Anishinaabe Ojibwe people. I am currently sitting on land that was forcefully taken from its original Dakota stewards. I am also using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous and rural communities. And we acknowledge the painful history of genocide and the ongoing colonization embedded in our communities as we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. We also acknowledge that we are still in the midst of a global pandemic, which is disproportionately affecting people of color due to the culture of anti-Blackness and white supremacy present in our society. We invite you to take a moment of breath right now where you are and consider where you are sitting, and acknowledge the past, present, and future stewards of the land and the community, as well as our responsibility to move forward with accountability and justice. So if you could take a moment of breath for yourself right now. Thank you. As we move into what is sure to be an incredible conversation today, we invite you to check in with yourself periodically to consider where creativity and justice connect in your own communities and your own work. And with that, I will pass things over to Drew Digby from the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council in Duluth. I have it written down wrong, sorry, Drew. In Duluth, Minnesota, who is the host of today's conversation. Over to you, Drew.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Springboard for the Arts. I really appreciate this opportunity. My name is Drew Digby. I'm the Executive Director of the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council. I'm a tall guy, about 6'2". I barely have any hair left. I still think it's dark brown, but everyone else tells me it's very gray. I am sitting here in Duluth at a place that is right at the center of the Treaty of 1854. When an artist, an Ojibwe artist, did windows, which you can see behind me if you're looking, for our building, she researched with some elders, and they considered this spot at a very important place called the Center of Good Things because it was a great trading spot. But I also know that my home that's just a few blocks away was at the center of a dispute where whites immediately after the Treaty of 1854 sort of fraudulently took some of the Ojibwe share of land from them and claimed it for white people, and leading to lawsuits which the whites eventually won. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm just very excited to be here with Em and Jack. It's just a real great honor for me. So what I'd like to do is I turn it over to Em Johnson and Jack Forinash, the executive directors of the Blue Sky Center in New Cuyama, California. Em and Jack, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. We're very excited. I'm Jack Forinash, use he, him. I'm wearing a new light colored corduroy shirt. I have glasses, unfortunately. I didn't get glasses until I was 28. I didn't know I needed them, but now I can't not wear them. I have brown hair, but with stress grays coming through. And I'm a list maker, a letter writer, a builder, spreadsheet artist, and I feel like my aspiring title is citizen architect and maybe even astronomer. I'm really into Uranus right now as my favorite planet. Yeah, I'm here in New Cuyama with M. Johnson, my co-director. We serve as executive directors of Blue Sky Center here in New Cuyama, California. M?
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today. My name is M. Johnson. I use she, her pronouns. And today I am here as the executive director of Blue Sky Center. I consider myself a rural investor. So I really enjoy entrepreneurial ventures in rural places. I'm originally from a rural community of less than 500 people in Missouri and migrated to California in 2015. And today we're sitting in Chumash land in the Cuyama Valley. Our communities, we have 3 communities in the Cuyama Valley: New Cuyama, Cuyama, and Ventucopa. We have around 1,000 people in our communities. We have a school district here in the Cuyama Valley. We have 2 restaurants. We have a hardware store. We have a post office. Things that we do not have, like grocery stores or entertainment options necessarily. We're naturally surrounded by the Sierra Madre and Caliente mountain ranges, and it's considered a high desert climate here in the Central Coast, California, and we're very happy to be here today.
All right. Why don't you sort of introduce us to the community a little bit more? What does it look like, feel like? I mean, you did a little bit already, but give us sort of an introduction to where you are.
Recently, an author and community member, Jane Slama, published a book called The Chronicle of the Cuyama Valley. And she opened the book with a statement about the Cuyama Valley being one of the last remaining places in the modern world that is hidden in plain sight. And I found that descriptor to be really honest to me. In the high desert region of the Cuyama Valley, we're often a forgotten valley in the Santa Barbara County region. It's extremely beautiful and mystical out here with the arid climate and the dry landscape, and not a lot of trees out here. Since living here, I've been here for 4 years now, I really find that what connects us as a community is our grit and determination to live in a very isolated, remote area together. Some of the descriptors that many community members pride themselves on is our unusual safeness of this community. Everyone knows each other, of course. We have only a few streets in the biggest town site, our city center of New Cuyama, which has 216 homes. And some of the activities that folks like to do in the Cuyama Valley are exploring off-roading. There's a lot of ranchers and rodeo enthusiasts in the Cuyama Valley, and it's definitely a pioneering atmosphere. Today, what Cuyama in the 1950s was founded by Atlantic Richfield Oil Company. So similar to many other rural communities throughout America, a big company came in and built the town around the company center. And so oil days in the 50s and 60s and 70s prospered in the Cuyama Valley. There's a newspaper that is archived now that calls the Cuyama Valley the Saudi Arabia of the West. And that really defines that atmosphere during the time. Today we're in an agricultural community. We're surrounded by industrial agricultural businesses. The large crop grown in the Cuyama Valley currently is carrots and organic carrots. Some of the crops also famous to the Cuyama Valley that are more appropriate to this arid climate are olives and pistachios. And we also still to this day have some of the homesteading families and ranching families that have been here for the past 200 years. And that's a little bit more about our community.
When was the last time it rained there?
Actually, just a week ago, we just got rain, and it was really interesting. It left snow on the mountains.
Cool. Tell us about your work. What does it look like and feel like? And, you know, how do you sort of give us this visceral example of your work?
Sure. I mean, I think in rural places in these organizations, you know, you're not able to just only talk about housing or only talk about arts or only talk about economic development. There's just not enough population, there's not enough organizations, there's not enough resources. So I find that a lot of times, and Blue Sky is one of these, that we talk about it in a way that's called community development, or specifically what we focus on is our role as for economic development. But that's kind of like a pyramid shape of economic development is the point and the lead, but in order to do that thing, of course, we need good and stable and accessible homes. We need to celebrate the existing culture here and provide opportunities for that within the population. There, of course, need to be jobs. The schools need to be supported. There's infrastructure. Water is an issue. All of our water comes from groundwater. Often in the middle of the valley, it's about 1,000 feet to water. We have no surface water in the valley. So all these things, you know, we stay aware of and go to those community meetings and keep that information and collect it. And I think oftentimes our role is maybe that of like a translator, and not like language translation, but more, we're just so different from the rest of Santa Barbara County, which is where we're sitting now. We're actually at the corner of 4 different counties: Kern County, San Luis Obispo, Ventura, and Santa Barbara. And what we say often is that we're actually, you know, the farthest away from all those county seats that you can be at the same time. It causes a lot of problems for data because, you know, census districts don't cross these invisible political boundaries. And people think of Cuyama in a geographic way as a valley, like the Cuyama Valley. So it's a lot of times just trying to get this information in a way that is, you know, first collected from our neighbors, from the residents here, but also communicated in a way that maybe someone living in Santa Barbara City or in Bakersfield, like, we need to be able to figure out how to communicate what's going on here and what the opportunities are here. So it's a lot of, you know, communicating, collecting and communicating in order so that when those resources come across their desks, they may think, oh, you know, no one needs that they think of Cuyama, and that Cuyama is a known place. And I think a lot of that's about data. At least a lot of the work that I work on is about data, where it's kind of like, and we all know this living in rural places, data can make you on the map or not. And so, yeah, I think what we are continuing to realize is that, you know, of course, like, humans invented data, and therefore, like, we also hold all that data. And so what we really can do is just ask our neighbors for that information. When the census fails us, when there's these invisible political boundaries failing us to communicate what we feel is the reality, or, you know, a lot of data is comparison data. So what we can actually do is just ask our neighbors for that information. And what we found is that people are really willing to provide that, you know, through time and trust built and duration of us working here, and the tangible projects that get done. People, there's still a priority of getting things done.
I would say on the ground every day, what our work looks like, it is different compared to who you're talking to. So in some days we're a cultural center. At Blue Sky Center, we have a lot of infrastructure we occupy what once was the Atlantic Richfield Oil headquarters. So we have around 24,000 square feet of commercial and industrial space, and agricultural land surrounding us. And so we host community events, we host community meetings, we have business workshops for business owners and entrepreneurs to learn financial skills and marketing skills and branding skills, etc. We also host small businesses in our community, small artisanal businesses in an incubation sort of way. We can talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. We also host artists in residence who work alongside of our community in different ways. And so we often, with new staff members, talk about how to describe Blue Sky Center. And it's really about our relationships in our community. And so maybe Blue Sky Center is known for providing cocoa at the Christmas parade, or maybe Blue Sky Center is known for being the airport, or maybe Blue Sky Center is known for providing resources to people. And so oftentimes these relationships come first, and then the collecting of data in this inclusive and inspiring way happens at the same time. So as Jack mentioned, we wear a lot of hats and we do a lot of hard work.
Okay, this is a slightly, hearing you talk, I'm very interested in one other piece about your community and your work before we dive into the big questions. I just think that there's 1,000 different rural identities in this country. How would you distinguish your rural area from other rural areas? Is it, if you describe it to somebody else at, say, the Rural Arts Summit, how would you say the Valley is a bit different?
I would say that looking at the rural areas in California in particular, it is very significantly different than rural areas in the Midwest and in the South and in the Northeast. And I would characterize this area as more of the pioneering West. So really very new rural areas. The town side of New Cuyama, after ARCO came in, has only been around for 70 years. And so I would also characterize our community in this particular ruralness as more isolated. We are very small in comparison to a lot of places in California, which is a really large state, obviously. And we're really far away from resources. So it takes about an hour at the least to get to a supermarket or a healthcare facility. And so we really operate in this more isolated rural landscape that is pretty new in comparison to other geographic areas.
And are you pretty, how close are you to sort of the gigantic industrial agriculture? Is that close or far away?
It's right here. So that's, I think industrial agriculture operates on more land than residential ownership in this valley.
Yeah, and like land zoning, which is hard to see as we're standing here, but the valley at 300 square miles or 192,000 acres, which of course not all of that is land under production, but 99% of the land is zoned as agricultural, and it's 0.01% to these other categories. Like Blue Sky owns all of the industrially zoned land, and that's still only like 27 acres of our property that's zoned that way. Yeah. Okay.
Ready, let's dive into our first topic, which is community engaged art. And what is that? I've heard a lot of conversations recently about community engaged art, but to you, what does it look like? What is the right way to talk about it? And especially in your case, what is the relationship between community engaged art and food and other systems like housing and workforce?
Well, I mean, I think, there's all these different terms out there in the world, but the term that we use here is creative community engagement. It's a term that Homeboat, another artist collective I work with, first described. You might hear of it be placemaking or placekeeping, that sort of thing. But I think what just takes it a little bit step further is that, well, first of all, Em and I both have art backgrounds or are artists, and then who we hire most often has that too. In our, our day-to-day staff, we have the AmeriCorps Vista program that we hire. We kind of have this rotating group of people that often will have art or creative backgrounds. And then also we use artists and creative professionals to execute the work. So it's about, calling ourselves whatever the funder wants us to call ourselves. It's a consultant or economic developer, just being kind of liberal in the use of that term. And then also like not capitalizing the A in artist or art too often, because if it is about, having our Vistas help with the soccer program or help with the theater production in the winter at the rec district, or being in the schools, like it's whatever, we let people describe us however they want, unless it's wrong, and then we'll talk about it and correct them. But like Im was saying, like if they perceive us as, if someone in town perceives us as fulfilling a certain role, as long as it's right, we don't try to get into the big, the 30,000 foot view of things, I guess. You want to talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, in terms of how we value creative community engagement and community engaged art in terms of economic development is really about understanding that wealth and generating wealth, it goes beyond economic wealth and includes social capital and cultural capital. And we really identify creative professionals as the stewards of creating inclusive and thriving places and spaces for people to connect. And one of the most beautiful opportunities in rural places are the connections that people make in order to generate wealth and sustainability for their communities. And so community engaged art or creative community engagement really is about creating those welcoming spaces and opportunities for local champions to emerge and to celebrate what strengths there are in this community and in this landscape and environment surrounding them. And so it really has so many possibilities.
Okay. All right. Why don't you spend a little more time on an intersection, whether it's about food or housing. Jack, you talk about really being community design is important. Talk about a little bit that intersection of sort of with, between art itself and one of these other really core things in your communities.
Food?
Yeah, I can talk about food a little bit. At Blue Sky Center, Jack and I have different areas of focus that we like to, so that we keep our hands dirty and also have the ability to go and visit other rural spaces. And so one of those focus areas for me has been food systems and understanding and designing a more resilient food system for our Cuyama Valley communities. And so in the past, we have learned a great deal about what projects to invest in to address issues and problems facing our community, such as food access and security. Our communities are in what is known as a food apartheid situation, really showcasing the inequities of food access for our farm worker community members who grow our food and yet don't have access to the food that they are cultivating and stewarding. So when you look at it just with an economic development lens, you create this matrix of opportunities that might include such things as farmers market or a cold storage facility was one of those that we looked deeply in the Cuyama Valley, because if you talk to food aggregators or food providers, they often say that there's a lack of cold storage, which would allow fresh food being grown in the community to stay in that community. So you start looking at all of these, and that's with a strictly economic development lens. And we did that in 2017 at Blue Sky Center with our agricultural stakeholders from our biggest farms, our medium-sized farms and small farms, as well as community advocates like our Family Resource Center and our school district here in the Cuyama Valley. But then with the power of creative professionals and how they can take that data, so they take these opportunities and they run it through the community, they engage with the community in more inclusive settings. We received a few grants that were able to hire culinary artists to come in and set up unique intergenerational spaces to talk about, just unique culturally specific opportunities like Nepalese cultivation and harvesting. That's, this cactus variety that's grown very effectively out here. We also had heirloom corn workshops. We had natural yeast workshops with women in the valley. And these opportunities, instead of creating this list of investment opportunities and then just putting it into the community without asking, or instead of running a survey potentially that maybe didn't provide the amount of context people needed to talk about what they really wanted to see. This was creating safe, culturally engaging, intergenerational spaces for people to gather and celebrate and teach each other and share what they've been growing at home and what they cook at home. And really with no intention, with no expectation out front, our goal was really just to create a welcoming and warm atmosphere for folks to step up and say what they wanted to see in this community. And what we heard was so surprising. It wasn't necessarily like that we were going to invest in direct food access, putting more food in the hands of more people. We started to learn from this process that would change the food buying habits of our whole community, which didn't seem very relevant or needed through the eyes of our community members. But instead, they wanted more places to gather and share different culinary options. So it really highlighted that we only have 2 restaurants in town, and they're both known for their burgers. And folks wanted to see more taco stands and areas and more culturally specific food options that were affordable and for the family. And so we invested then, because we're an infrastructure, we have infrastructure and investment opportunities. So we invested in a food truck, now called the Cuyama Kitchen, where different community members can come and try out their new food venture idea. And it's allowed for folks to come in and do different catering options, as well as food preservation and baking and other opportunities. And so it really shows the power of how artists can really take data and take these investment opportunities, run them through the community in this inclusive, welcoming, and celebratory strategy, like celebratory project specific ways. And what it uncovers is much more sustained community investment in the outcomes.
I'll just chime in that I think, we've recently did this, we got this grant from HUD, basically kind of to fill in the gaps of the census. And it was a housing, HUD housing agency. It's a Section 4 grant. It was passed through Enterprise Community Partners, a national organization. And so the goal was to make a survey and to make a report. And it had a housing focus. But what we learned pretty soon was that, like I was saying before, like housing is a critical component of a community, and it's tied directly to these other things. And so what the report became was more of an action plan report with 7 different priorities, housing being one, but rural broadband, which we don't have, being another, water issues, school system support, economic development, of course, being in there, food systems. So this all became kind of a report, but in the end, or like through that process too, it was, collecting this survey. Sorry, phone's ringing. Doing this survey and, hiring a graphic designer to do the design of the survey, hiring, using our staff, our artist staff to execute that work. And then also Noe Montes is a photographer that's been working with us for a couple years, using him to help talk about this in a normal human way that isn't this this abstraction that happens with the survey. So we just got our first arts grant from the state of California. It's first arts grants, and this one came from the state of California. And we're again using Noe Montes and then also Corbin Lamont from the Office of Virtue to turn this information into infographics and into conversations. So yeah, now we know a lot about the housing conditions here, and that may lead to being more informative and collecting more resources to address those issues. But having those conversations in a way that doesn't seem like you're being interviewed, and also happens, you know, at the Dia de los Muertos or at, you know, the bar, having those conversations in ways that people, you know, aren't under fluorescent lights in a weird space, having to show up, you know, in the middle of the day when that's just not, that's not a priority for a lot of people, especially, and it often isn't the priority or isn't available. That's a luxury that's not available to the people that could most be benefit from those conversations or the results of that work. So yeah, I think, you know, the literal version is like turning that data into infographics and making that accessible. It's no way having a photo day where you take pictures of the family, and so you walk away with this professional photograph that otherwise, I don't know where you'd go, to Bakersfield somewhere to get a photograph. And then also while you're there, hey, like, what are the priorities for you and your family right now? Like, here's some things that came up from the survey. We talked about housing, talked about internet, but like, what do you think is, like, what should there be investment in right now? And having that in a way that's kind of, you know, more normal, more human.
Yeah, talk a little bit about, I think one of the things that from the outside that is nice to see at the Blue Sky Center is that you're not just competing in the small pie of arts funding, but you've realized that there's these other, whether it's Department of Ag funding or HUD funding or something else. But I think you also have this advantage as artists that when you go into communities, you listen to people rather than in a classic economic development way say, hey, we're moving this into your community because it's going to be good for you. But talk for a second about the funding options and why that's been important to you, is to not just go into the pie of arts funding.
You got it, or me?
I can try.
Okay.
We get really excited to talk about this this asset for artists out there, to think about when we think about funding in rural America, and as rural artists and as rural economic developers, we all share the sense of frustration because without going too deeply into it, we do know just generally the amount of resources allocated to rural areas is so much smaller than urban areas. And if you even look at the definition of rural and urban and the way that our government refers to us, they have so many criteria for different metropolitan areas and urban areas, so many cross-sections and subcategories. And then once they have all that done, once they get to defining rural, it's really the other. It's really the not urban definition. And that really gives you the idea of how inequitable funding resources are. So then you get to thinking about arts funding, and that's even smaller, especially if you're in a rural setting with a very small population that doesn't provide a lot of promotional opportunities for the arts funding agency. So when we started utilizing economic development funding, we were really going at this with a mindset, instead of fighting the system that is broken and inequitable and really not working for our places, and also putting our places in this definition of the other and this definition of not necessary or not necessary for opportunity investment, we started trying to flip our perspective and see these opportunities to form, to say, like, let's use this language, let's use this economic development language, let's use this housing language. Let's, instead of hiring our traditional consultant in economic development terms, let's hire artists as our consultants, which passes through. Let's use all these deliverables that USDA is asking us to use. And then in our reporting to them, let's activate this new understanding that, because of where your restrictions are lying with rural places, this is how we utilize your funding, and this is also how we enacted much more inclusive and much more effective strategies in our rural places with the things that you would not fund such as like food at meals, or maybe that's, artist supplies. Like maybe let's utilize this private public investment of USDA government resources, yes, but also private investment through our own earned revenue streams, our own entrepreneurial ventures, and through this very, I guess you could say, like business-minded approach, we're able to do this like activism, I would say, with our reporting, that really showcases that yes, we can use federal funding. You're still not funding us in the most effective way, and also let's try to advocate for much more inclusive deliverables, much more inclusive funding allocation in our regional sectors.
I think, yeah, well, we spend a lot of time making reports, and we make those reports beautiful. So we use like Noe Montes's pictures as landscape photos and photos of real people to illustrate information. So in all these federal grants too, we're putting in that money for the designer, for the artist, for the production, the printing costs, and making beautiful reports that aren't just PDFs. Of course, we make the PDFs too, but we print a lot of things. It helps that my dad's a printer, and so we get good deals on that. But we send out a lot of physical reports that hopefully are ones that are nice enough that don't just immediately go into the trash. We spend a lot of time on annual reports, a lot of time on grant reports. It's not just a Google Doc saved as a PDF and sent to the funder, but it's actually a curated, well-designed, beautiful thing that gives us hopefully that chance that they remember us, or hopefully that chance that it stays on their desk a little bit longer till some coworker comes by or some other funder comes by and says, "What's this?" We make things that can be put up on the wall. Part of the annual report had this this art piece to be on the wall so that people are like, "What's that?" So it's just, I think it's really, and we have all of our reports on our website, blueskycenter.org/reports, and we make a lot of reports. And I think that's really important to exhibit what M's saying, that it's doing what the grant needs. You have to list out the deliverables that you met, but it's also talking in a way that's talking about the real humans behind that work, and the representation that we're making, and who we're seeking to represent through this information, which again, it's about communicating that information. If people know there's lots of resources, we live in a very well-off county comparatively, but all the resources, all the traditional resources are ideas of political power, tied to money, tied to property tax. Rural places are always going to have lower property tax. They're always going to have less people. By definition, that's what rural places are. So how do we communicate, and how do we say, what, if you're going to bring resources, if you're going to think about us, here's the things that we're defining for ourselves of what opportunities exist here.
What's an example, though, of a time when, in sort of crossing in that world to economic development, that the two worlds didn't work so well together? Because you must have had that experience as well.
Yes, I was just about to say that actually, because definitely one of the unique factors of our particular rural place is that we're unincorporated. So our town sites are unincorporated. And as Jack mentioned earlier on in our description of this place, we are the furthest away from the 4 counties that we touch, their political centers. And because of that, and because of our unique Central Coast California region definition, we also do not lie in what is opportunity zones, which are prioritized in federal funding for socially disadvantaged communities. And so we really have to think creatively. Once again, this is where it is so powerful to hire artists to create more innovation and creative solutions to how are we going to create sustaining funding and resources coming in. So oftentimes when we are not applicable, like we cannot apply for some of these federal fundings because we don't meet their definitions. On top of this unincorporated status, this lying outside of an opportunity zone is the way that the census is done in the United States. And Jack can maybe point out a few more statistics on that, but you can really understand as we are so isolated that the US Census does not provide us accurate data that reflects what our current realities are. So it's really important for us to figure out ways to define our own geographic, political, demographical data, have our community define its own needs, and for us to form really successful partnerships with our county and state, and showcase a reputation that allows them to trust these reports and utilize them in their budget allocations versus going to the U.S. Census, for instance, to allocate budgets to the Cuyama Valley, which does not happen. So we do not receive very many grants, and because of that, we've been successful at utilizing federal funding, but it is an uphill battle. And as everyone in this field will know, it's not a system that is going to change anytime soon. And so this slow, deliberate motion is how do we think outside of the box? And so that's what's led to us really shifting our focus more towards entrepreneurial ventures and creating earned revenue streams to supplement this work.
Yeah, I think, well, federal grants are cumbersome, but luckily we have experience in it. And I think rural organizations too should be and can be this way to access those resources and collect them. Because the great thing about federal resources is that they pay for staff. They'll even pay for some indirect costs. You know, usually you can get 10% without a question asked for indirect costs. Versus, you know, private philanthropy especially wants to see, you know, a receipt of what materials you bought for that, you know, art event or for that workshop. And so then they think that somehow artists work for cheap, or that they should donate their time, or that there's no cost. And there's often not that understanding. So I think it's paired, like a best version is of course to have a diversified pie of where you're getting money from, so that you can have money to pay for people and the insurance that you need and the property taxes, but you also have this money to pay for the supplies. And of course, a lot of federal resources want that matching funding, which has to come from non-federal resources. So the great thing about another like advocacy for what people should look into is the AmeriCorps program, specifically the VISTA program, which provides free people here that work for us. We've had 4 each year for the past 3 years, and now we've scaled down to 2, but full-time people here working, and their main role is capacity building. Their main role is seeking and finding these grants and then operating them. And there's some organization where you are that has that capacity to host those people. I mean, you have to have full-time people, supervisors there, and you have to be compelling. You have to get a bunch of reports in, and those reports are just scrolling pages of spreadsheets of every single number that you ever want. So I think the burden can be handled by these rural organizations like ours, and then that way the artists can show up and we can create fair and inclusive both ways of outreaching for artists, but also paying them, so that when they're buying something, we're buying it for them. Or if they buy it, we're reimbursing it. It's not going on to a 1099. I had to get this 1099 once that had $12,000 of supplies on it that I had to then hire an accountant, even though I do bookkeeping for my day job. I had to hire an accountant because it was overwhelming to try to get this off of my tax burden, because this organization just didn't get it and said, you know, well, we gave you the money for it. And so it's things like that where like we hope to free up the artist to do the work that the artist and creative professional is really good at. And we can handle the bureaucracy and the paperwork that is inherent to federal applications. And of course, as an individual, you can't apply for federal money anyway. So it's about finding that organization that has the capacity, and then, you know, getting them to get these resources. The federal money spends an F ton of money. Sorry for the French. So much money. And through the pandemic, what have they been doing? Spending a ton of money. So as these pies of arts money shrink or pause or have new priorities or have complicated, you know, overly cumbersome applications, the federal government, the state governments have continued to spend a lot of money. And so if you keep trying for this 1% arts funding slice, and then you're in a rural place, it's like 1/10 of 1%, then maybe let's stop beating our heads against the wall and go for where the money is. Call yourself an economic developer, call yourself a consultant, whatever the box says, just check that box and do those deliverables and meet the expectations, but do it better. And we're better at doing it better. We're not going to show up in khakis and, you know, for this like 10-minute exercise at City Hall under fluorescent lights and check off the box that said we did community outreach.
Let's continue sort of talking about sort of this different worlds piece. One thing I've noticed is that sometimes economic developers want to use artists, but they want artists to do exactly what they think they would do. And the beauty of artists is that artists have their own vision. So how do you develop that trust between those worlds? And how do you get to the point where economic developers and communities trust the artist and the artist's visions for what needs to happen, instead of saying, go put art on that building because I have a report here that says that that will have a good economic benefit?
Yeah, I mean, here's an advantage of being unincorporated is that there is no economic developer here. Like, you know, we're filling that role. There's not anyone we need to convince. So I think, you know, in a city, in prior places I've worked with, other places I've worked, there is that person that does, you know, think it's solved by a mural or that it's solved by some event. And so I think, well, first of all, like, to kind of like frame this better, like rural places often are described as slow. And I think that that's pejorative. And I think what is the reality is that we're deliberate. We're very specific in how we're using the resources because we have less traditional resources. We have a lot of abundance of other resources. But one of those abundance of resources is that through duration, through working with someone, with your community for a while, getting that trust at the speed of trust, and through the work over time, you can get to the point of, I kind of lost my train of thought. You build the trust over time.
I could jump in.
Jump in.
Thinking about instead of in traditional economic development, what I'm seeing in my experience, what I'm seeing is a prescribed solution, oftentimes coming from urban areas or other places or other reports, and then that being placed in the communities. And with this deliberate understanding, building trust, building relationships, what we're able to see is a much more sustainable process of community investment. And so if we are to describe how economic developers should trust artists, we should really look at what have been the successes or wins of economic development in the past, what have been the failures of economic development in the past. If you look at the failures specifically, you see a lot of inefficiency of resource allocation. You see a lot of money going places and not a lot of sustained impact and not a lot of inclusive, especially for our BIPOC and Indigenous and LGBTQIA folks in our communities who have been just completely left out in so many of those failed solutions. And what an artist can do and what a creative professional can do is create that safe space, provide dignified solutions that are human-centric, which allows for much more resilient, holistic, environmentally sustainable solutions oftentimes. So if you think about some of the successful creative innovations in rural places, you might think of things like food hubs, which are unique opportunities that reduce the carbon footprint of where food is traveling. Oftentimes the food is being grown in gardens and community gardens in people's backyards with small farms. And they're also connecting people with resources, and they're also gathering places for people to civically engage with one another. You might also think of cooperatives, the successful rural cooperatives across places, which create worker equity and create values that last a really long time and jobs that last a really long time. And so I think for economic developers and artists to have a conversation, we just need to hire artists as economic developers versus economic developers hiring artists to pursue one deliverable. And so that might also take the form of artists being in political power in jurisdictions that are incorporated and do allow for artists to run for office. And we really need to see art, as Jack mentioned earlier, not with a capital A in the arts world, but really as the central tool to move away from inequitable systems of governance, of economic development, of resource allocation, and more towards community resilience.
Yeah, I just wrap up to say that in my thought that that we're moving deliberately and we're moving with less traditional resources, and comparatively, especially here in Santa Barbara County, comparatively we're quote low income. That's probably not how my neighbors think about themselves. We're socially disadvantaged. Maybe those aren't terms. These are like grant terms and ways to access pots of money and check off boxes, but you can't show up with, those aren't terms that stand the sniff test at the dinner table or at the community table. So I think that just that we have to move deliberately. It has to be in a way that is using less traditional resources, but isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? Aren't we supposed to be using, depending less on traditional money? Aren't we supposed to be using less energy? The work that is done in rural places, we need to reframe it. That it's deliberate, it's not slow, and that it's doing a lot more with less. And that's we are the model of doing that. Rural places are historically the source of innovation, but also we are the model of making that piece of irrigation pipe work, because there's not a Home Depot for 2 hours. So we're very creative in the population that exists here already. And so when people, kind of city people are like, oh, are there artists in Cuyama? I've probably just told them that there's 1,100 people living here, because that's their first question is how many people live there. Oh, are there artists there? And I say, yeah, 1,100. And then they give me this weird look. But just let's just reframe it. Let's not let these urban ideas have to squish our great idea into an urban framework or an urban biased way of thinking about it or way of funding.
Talk a little bit more about sort of community ownership and buy-in. I think that's something that you guys have done well, is to sort of get the community to buy into your projects. And what does that look like for you guys? How do you get that community buy-in?
Yes, well, something Jack says around the office often is you can do anything, but you can't do everything. Excuses. And in order to gain the community opt-in approach, as community members ourselves, and as we look to other organizations who are doing this really well, I think it's really the idea that it's really the ethos that we understand that change, yes, needs to happen, and opportunities, yes, need to be brought in, and yes, we have a lot of problems, almost insurmountable challenges ahead. But oftentimes what makes small places great is what brings us together and what connects us. And oftentimes that is, what's available for our youth, what is available to be better neighbors to one another, what is available to celebrate the unique cultural identity of a place. And so when you're working in development, you may see every day the insurmountable challenges ahead of you, such as environmental challenges, water scarcity, food access, the lack of job security and jobs in general in places. But if you just focus on that problem, if you just think about how we relate as human beings, if we're only just focused on the problem, it may create a lot of momentum for a short burst of time, but doesn't have a long-lasting, committed impact. But instead, if you are thinking like a business like a business owner or a neighbor, even, you may see these small wins, these opportunities for small wins to create more, maybe it's more celebratory civic spaces. Maybe it's identifying the cuisine of your place. Maybe it's just creating a new opportunity for folks to interact in your community. And these little, they're not little, but these smaller impacts actually go very far in terms of our relationship building in communities. So how do people opt in? It's about celebrating your assets and your strengths and your individual skills, your social capital, your cultural capital. If you want to think of it in economic development terms, there are terms to describe this. And by focusing there, starting with the social capital, leading to the economic opportunity, you're going to see a lot more long-term sustained growth and impact in communities.
Okay. Let me move us along to a moderately related question about different business structures. You guys have done some good experimenting with thinking about, how to, well, it's actually not a new idea, the sort of rural cooperative, but sort of reaching into that past has been very successful. And you talk about your examples that you've gone in that direction.
Right, I get so passionate when I think about this subject because this actually, personally, I was inspired by cooperatives and rural investment after working in the philanthropic world and seeing these patterns develop over time that, in my experience, were trapping communities in this aid model and this like reliance on outside funding coming in, and seeing this distrust. In my experience, is distrust forming of those funding sources because they weren't of the community and for the community and by the community. What the opportunities are with investing in rural cooperatives and small business growth in small communities, what we're seeing is businesses that are made for the community, by the community, leading to much more long-term growth and resilience in communities in the future. So in our experience at Blue Sky Center, because we have this unique space with a lot of infrastructure, and we had investment from a very, creative donor who was able to allow us to try things and fail at them and continue to fund us. His goal was, can we find a self-sufficient model? Can we find a model that doesn't have to rely so much on outside grant sources? So he invested enough operationally the first few years of Blue Sky Center's history to really try and fail. And some of those failures might have been investing in a utility service. So we've tried solar utilities and failed at that. We tried, that was one of our first revenue streams that didn't work out. And it was very, very, I would say, elaborate to try with that big of a model. So we scaled down and we thought of tourism and hospitality. And so the idea to invest in tourism and hospitality for our Cuyama communities came from research into other rural communities in Appalachia specifically, and others in the Pacific Northwest, which were founded on with company dollars. So that may be mill towns, factory towns, in our case, an oil town, and those places finding that once that company left, the economy left with them, and leaving a lack of leadership, leaving a lack of infrastructure for folks to go to for resources, and leaving a lack of innovative entrepreneurship. So many of those places have found a resurgence in small business and investment in their artisans and their skills through tourism and hospitality, which brings enough outside money into a community to start investing in small business growth. So with our space, we launched a glamping initiative, which is glamorous camping for those that may not know the term. And once again, it was because of the artists that are in our network. And at the time in our communities, our one motel and restaurant in New Cuyama wasn't really operating. It was only open a few days of the week. And so we really didn't know what was going to happen when we launched this glamping initiative called Explore Cuyama. But since then, over the past 3 years, we've seen of growth and new opportunities for revenue streams for businesses, including a wine tasting program with a local regenerative organic orchard. We've seen horseback riding programs with our ranchers who are retired and looking for a new revenue stream, or are not operating as much cattle as they once were. And we even now have new owners of that inn and restaurant who are investing really heavily in renovation and bringing in a locally sourced menu there. So we've really seen a lot of really celebratory and beautiful things happen. Notwithstanding that, we were able to hire a staff member from our local community, which was a resident whose goal and ambition it is to invest, do event planning and do weddings. And so for us, that was a huge success as an economic development organization to create a job. Today, we are launching our newest earned revenue stream, which is a little bit more risky, I would say, for any organization. And we're very excited to see how it goes. And it's called Cuyama Beverage Company. Cuyama Beverage Company came out of the problem in our communities with facing a water crisis in the Cuyama Valley, and considering the fact that we may have a changing agricultural landscape in the next 10 years due to a recent jurisdictional plan that went into place that will charge growers with pumping, will restrict pumping, and will charge them with extra bills and et cetera for pumping water out of this valley. So we were considering there's a lot of opportunity to invest in regenerative agriculture in the Cuyama Valley facing this problem. But what can we do first? And one of the first things that we can do is put more revenue into the pockets of the farmers already growing climate appropriate products, like I mentioned earlier. And so one of those products that we were really excited to gather energy around was honey cultivation in the valley. This is a premium spot for very clean, organic, beautiful honey. And how can we add value to that product, creating an opportunity for many more businesses to form? So creating an alcoholic beverage, actually creating a session mead that could be branded with Cuyama language that could tell the story of this beautiful, mystical, amazing place here in the Central Coast, and really telling the story of investing in honey, investing in our farms. This is the ethos of what we're creating with this really high quality beverage. We also wanted to create a beverage that was easily drinkable in this hot weather out here. So in California, folks flock to the desert for its unique landscape and its heat. And so we wanted an easy drinking, sparkling, effervescent beverage, and we really hit the nail on the head with this first beverage that we're going to be launching in 2021. And the background of how do we create this business structure, to me, just opened up my eyes on a long-term strategic plan for Blue Sky Center. It's not just about creating a high quality product that can be distributed for the Cuyama Valley. This could be the first step of many additional products, value-added products that can snowball from this. It's once again just demonstrating a strength and asset in the Cuyama Valley and letting whatever comes of it happen. So for me, it was also about, can we set up this business structure in a way that created equity at the ground up? So can we create not just new investment and revenue stream for our farmers, not just a new product that values the Cuyama Valley and showcases its strengths, but also can we create it in such a way that the workers of this company are owners of this company? And this really took the same successes of rural cooperatives everywhere across our nation into consideration, and also gets back to, can Blue Sky Center actually be a rural incubator? Now we see in urban spaces, incubation just being an influx of a lot of capital, and then a really quick turnaround, a business either succeeding or failing within a 1 to 5 year period of time. Rural places, as Jack mentioned, we're deliberate, it's durational, it's sustainable, it can be much more resilient. So can incubation look like, instead, for companies like ours with so much infrastructure, investing in a company, seeding its fruition, bringing together all the players and pieces, and launching it, staying as a shareholder, building it up, providing job training, providing technical assistance to the workers for however long they need it. And as that develops, you know, the next step could be launching a distribution company. The next step could be launching a brewing facility. And these things could continue with the same concept of building cooperative structures, really dismantling what we're seeing is not working in some spaces, which is, you know, broken governance systems, broken bureaucratic systems, ineffective funding models, and we're building it from scratch. Not necessarily from scratch, we're using successes of other rural places, but we're building it in a way that's just really local, asset driven, and investing in people in a slow and in beautiful way.
That's great. Let me jump to some questions. And we've been talking about economics for a while and local economics. And one of the first questions sort of takes us into a slightly different realm. How can the community engagement focus of rural arts organizations like yourselves bridge the philosophical divides in our country? You know, what advantage do you have when you sort of bring it into the philosophical difference or political differences, or not?
I guess I don't quite understand the philosophical part of that question, that phrasing of it. I mean, I don't know if this is answering it, but what I think a lot about is, again, this idea that we all hold the information that is needed. And oftentimes it's just about asking for that information. But in order to ask for that, you have to have been around. Ruralorganizing.org had a training on this about voting trends. And one of the main slides that I keep thinking about, ruminating about, is that we need to care and celebrate first. That the critique comes later. That in order to be a part of a community and to be respected and to be even asked for your opinion, you have to be there to care and celebrate. And that means time. That means it takes time. It means that, you know, for example, on this survey, like we drafted a survey, we put it out to 10 people that were closer to our network, trying to, you know, pick out different demographics or different lengths of time that they've lived here. And, you know, it was a 63 question survey that had some personal questions in there, nothing identifying, but, you know, what's your income level? How many bedrooms do you have? Again, in a way to try to replace the census, but also questions of like, you know, where should money be invested by Santa Barbara County? What infrastructure improvements? What's your most urgent healthcare need? And by the way, a side note, this was in late 2019, but already over 50% of people, this is an open-ended question, what's your most urgent healthcare need? Over 50% of people answered to an open-ended question, health access, just having access at all. So I think that was a tangent, but the thing is that we have all this information that is needed, and it takes time. And testing out that survey with people, you know, I had people not respond, and I was like, all right, well, let's go. I'm going to go and talk to them in person because it's really important to get this like response. And first of all, they just needed to know, you know, why are you asking this? You know, what's the real source to this, or what's going to happen from this? So we've gotten better at the first outset saying, you know, the reason we're doing this survey is because it might lead to things like this, but we're not guaranteeing anything. It's all anonymous. So just phrasing it better, but also like knowing that in this specific example that this guy liked to drink Coors Light. So I showed up with a 12-pack of Coors Light, gave him a couple, and then he told me his real opinion about why he doesn't want to answer the money question and how it's an invasive, like some of the questions I just never thought, I thought they were very harmless, but it's just a matter of rephrasing. It's a matter of, you know, setting up the prompt. And also we put a $2 bill in every single one because there's that little like acknowledgement of you're going to give us some time and some perspective, and $2 isn't what the value is, but it's fun. It's considered lucky in a lot of cultures. It's considered queer in a lot of cultures, which is great and funny, a little joke that I had, but it was just, that helped. And so we got 143 responses from 363 households. So 42% of the community responded, and that's just a huge number for a survey in general.
Putting that, like, coalescing with what Jack's saying, I think is, when it comes to philosophical divides, which to me, the context I was thinking of as political divides as well. It seems when it's in the media or when it's in this national context, it often seems so, there's a dichotomy. It's either this or that. And what rural spaces are, when you can actually talk to people and bring them a beer and like read and switch the phrasing of what you're asking and what you're finding together, is there's this beauty of small places where you have a shared commitment to your community, a shared commitment to the sustainability of your place. And it really showcases that your opinions and your philosophies are so nuanced and have so many beautiful, aspects to them. And so what our small places can really teach our urban spaces during a time of divide, exacerbated by what we're seeing online, is just that a sense of community brings about the many differences within that community and nuanced opinions in that community. And maybe we should just start there again. Like, maybe we should just go back to our communities and connect over our love of them.
Okay, that's great. I think one question that some people who are listening are interested in is what proportion of artists, local versus non-local, however you define it, you end up in your work, and if there are artists that you bring in from the outside, how do they engage with community members, in that way? Or is it all locals in your work?
Yeah, I think I'll talk about some things, but I think if you're talking about like the growers as creatives too. But we certainly have a mix. So there's a program like a more traditional artist in residence, the national call, and we bring in people for 3 weeks at a time to have that experience. And I think it's really like fulfilling our role as like helping to bring people into a space they haven't been, but specifically a rural space, to kind of like give of all this that we've built, this trust that we've built over time and access, to give them a little slice of that and to help and to let them, kind of maybe push their creative practice or see, a different rural narrative than what they are normally hearing. But then also we work a lot with someone like Noe Montes or Corbin Lamont, like people that are coming often and regularly through different ways, so we build that duration with the artists that we're working with to continue to come back and to continue to have new perspectives and, paying them for their time and for their travel and for their supplies. And then within the community, as we hosted that grantor, I mentioned Enterprise Community Partners. They had a big convention in Boston that we went to as a recipient, and they said, "Oh, we're going to do another one. Where should we do it?" And we just like snuck around the room and got everyone to vote for us. So all of a sudden we had 25 people from these big cities, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, Atlanta. All these people were coming and staying here. And through that process, we were using the screen printer on site here to do to make a specific bandana for the event, and everyone got to screen print it and see the operation. We had a local Chumash lady provide some grounding and perspective. We had a couple farmers come and talk about their small farm that is organic and producing and specific to the water context, to talk about the water issues. So we charged this funder and now corporate retreat person, they charged them all these, these things to both make it a more interesting thing, because we couldn't, there was no bar for it. But we did have the bar open, especially for us, on a night that they were here during the week. But there's no, when we were in Boston, we went to all these different events, and we spent a lot of time on the bus traveling. And we didn't have to spend any time on the bus because you could walk the whole town in a couple minutes. So we had a lot more opportunity to use what they were going to pay for their event to support the people here locally. And I think just to a point of like with the growers and how that is also a creative practice. And
Yeah, I would say it's hard to like give a percentage of what amount of creative professionals are coming and visiting and spending their time here, and what amount are from here and local residents, longtime local residents, because everything we do it's with the strategy of can we create this space for you to thrive and really push your boundaries as an artist, and whether that may be. And when it comes to working with our small farmers and ranchers in the Cuyama Valley, it's a very similar process. It's a very similar environment to when we bring in an artist like Noe Montes over the past 3 years, where they're coming in, they're gathering and talking and setting up spaces to talk about like, you know, ways they can share resources together and create new products in the valley. Like what is the extent of like what can be innovated in terms of what they're growing in the Cuyama Valley and how they're growing it, and sharing those resources as neighbor to neighbor, farmer to farmer. And so some of the most beautiful things that we've seen is farmers getting together who haven't seen each other in over 10 years, even though they live right next to each other, and learning that of this new, you know, system of how they are, you know, bringing back native indigenous plants and on their properties, and this system is connecting them once again to each other. And you know, as I mentioned earlier, when we work with Alicia Tapp, who cultivates honey at Rockfront Ranch in the Cuyama Valley, we're talking to her and figuring out ways to invest in new products that she could potentially, you know, have in her repertoire, you know, as a rancher. And so for us, once again, an artist, like how do you define that? And it's anyone who's, yeah, with creative, you know, creative ambitions and drive and diligence and thoughtfulness and I guess like the ability to innovate and disrupt whatever system it may be.
That's great.
Yeah.
I go ahead, Jack. Did you have one other thing there before asking the next question?
Another side note, a lot of the visiting artists we have working in the schools, because there's not an art teacher there. There are teachers that try to include art programming, but with it not being a part of the state requirements, it makes it harder. So also like, you know, every kid is an artist till they get made fun of or told that they're not, or told that it's not, you know, financially viable. So when we have artists in there, you know, we had a screen printer that out of the 200 kids attending the elementary, middle, and high school, she did an activity with every single one of them. So all of these kids are cultivating and making their art too. And then that product, you know, that t-shirt or that bandana or that drawing going home to the household, you know, that's a conversation. That's a point of access for us. That's a way, you know, if you do activities involving kids, who shows up? The parents and grandparents. So yeah, I think even if they are from the outside, we're of course like requiring and instilling and like shepherding like a level of respect and acknowledgement. They're not allowed to just come and do whatever they want and helicopter away. So I think, you know, and then using those maybe not here talents for these kids to see someone that looks like them, you know, having a professional practice that earns them money.
Okay. I just really enjoy listening to you guys, so thank you. But let me ask you a final question. What is your hope or a piece of advice you'd like to offer as we work towards the future together?
My hope is that we are able, through hard work and through just our actions, through hard work, we're able to redefine what development, the definition of development, and redefine the arena of work that we're in, away from prescribed solutions and more towards investing in strengths and opportunities on the ground, which allows for this disruption of the system and stewarding of the future to happen simultaneously. And so I truly believe our rural spaces are the catalyst for what we want to see as a progressive world in terms of a more resilient world, and a world that's in more harmony with our environment and our people and our cultures. And so I really think that it seems like this huge concept and philosophy, but I don't think that it actually is. What we're seeing is it's actually just like on the ground hard work. Like this work is justified. I'd love to see more people join this work and find validity in this type of job choice as rural developers.
For me, my hope would be that, people will recognize themselves as data and data holders, and that data is powerful and it can empower other people, and that if you selfishly withhold it, then you're not allowing for that to be informative and helpful for other people's lives. So, and all data is biased. I think we all know that, but just to remember that. But that's also the opportunity that your information and data needs a human perspective. If you just collect information and make a chart and put it back out, that's not enough. We need context. We need your perspective as a human with your experience, with your history. We need that filter added on top of that. And that filter should have a call to action. It should lead to it. It should be well informed. It should be community-based. This call to action, it's not something done in a vacuum. If you certainly need to talk to a lot of people about it as you're developing it, but the call to action needs to exist. And I think just as a broad thought, there's a bunch of ones and zeros data that's dehumanizing and it has more apps and more screens and more things that we all know now. Clearly, we all know now that the wrong people are profiting off of all that information that we're giving to them. We're signing over to them. So I'm not talking about turning off your tracking on your Maps app or whatever, or asking for your records from Google. I'm talking about you have data as yourself, as a human being in the world, and it's very specific to your place and time and circumstance and your history. And together, if we can share that information in safe ways, but if we can share that information and build a story that has a perspective, then that's compelling, and that can empower, and that can have a call to action.
Well, thank you. I think I really appreciate this. I think the one piece that I want to leave folks with is I love the way that I think listen is too shallow a word for what you do with your community, the way you engage it, the way you feel them, that you see their assets, you see the beauty in the community. I think that that's a way of looking at the world that's when rural areas are thriving, that's something that happens. And I hope other people follow your model in doing that. So thank you very much. Let me turn it over to Michelle for a closing. And thanks everyone very much for joining us today.
It's actually Hannah. I'm the new
Hannah.
today. No, that's fine. Yes, thank you so much. On behalf of Springboard for the Arts and myself personally, I just want to say another thank you to Drew for holding this space, and for Em and Jack for sharing all of your wisdom and questions and things you're wrestling with. We really appreciate that. And I hope that it gave some of our attendees things to think about and work with as we move forward. Obviously, this is one conversation of so many that we're going to be having and that we all are having in our own lives and our own communities. So I welcome this to continue in whatever way it wants to. As a reminder, our next episode of From the Field will take place on Friday, December 11th, not a Friday the 13th. That's nice. We made it through this one. And that one will feature Racing Magpie in Rapid City, South Dakota, and hosted by Ash Hansen from the Department of Public Transformation in Granite Falls, Minnesota. We'll follow up with attendees with the registration for that, as well as a short feedback form. And with that, I will just say, take care, stay safe, and have a good weekend. Find some time outside to breathe. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
We invite you to visit or email us. We'll share anything. We'll share our grant applications. We'll share all our information.